This conference will now be recorded.
And I'm going to hand it off to Mike.
Thanks everybody for joining us again. I'm kind of honored that so many people feel that these are worthwhile watching, and I kind of looked through the list, and I was kind of amazed. I had two-digit members sign up, and three-digit members sign up, and 24-digit members sign up. Thank you very much. With that, we'll get started here. I start. It's on gauges this time. The 53s, the dash layout was pretty much the same through 57. There's where all the gauges were. The speedometer was right in front of the driver. It was for 140 mile per hour. There was small dots at the 5 mile per hour range, and larger dots at the 10 mile an hour where the numbers were. The numbers is painted on the lens of the speedometer itself. The dots and numbers are a pale green. The odometer drums are black on the main part with white numbers, and the tenths is the opposite, white with black numbers. The layout of the speedometer, you got the high beam indicator at the top. You've got a left turn and a right turn at both sides, and the odometer is in the middle. And Ray, could you please take off of your video?
Okay. Well, I'm glad y'all having a good time.
Well, we're doing all right. We've had some people, knew some people with you, so we're doing okay. But I'll say an extra prayer for y'all and just be real diligent.
The needle itself is white 2/3 of the way down. Like I said before, the numbers are silk screen on the lens itself. The tachometer was right in the middle of the whole dash. For the 6 cylinders for 53, 54, and the 6 cylinders of 55, there was a 5,000 RPM tach with increments at 250, and there was a revolution counter at the bottom center, and at the bottom of the tach itself down in this area, it was stated tach in what they called fire orange, I believe is what they called the color. The auxiliary gauges, the fuel and temp was kind of put together. The round pointers, they had big dots at the numbers and smaller dots in between. The bottom half was chromed with a raised dome here kind of in the center. The other two gauges was the amp and the oil pressure, basically the same as the other two. The clock was to the right. The hands are tapered with rounded ends. 53 4 and the 55 6 cylinders were 6 volts, where the 55 V8s were 12 volts. They had a rounded back. They were made by Delco, and they will have an ink date on them. And that's the stamping on the back of the clocks for the early cars. In 55, when the V8s come out, the tachometer went to 6,000 RPM, increments of 500 instead of the 250 like the 6 cylinders were. Big dots at the 1,000 RPM and smaller dots at the 500 RPM range. Also, you had the tach at the bottom and the red lettering at the bottom. In 57, when the so-called airbox cars come out, they put an 8,000 tach mounted to the steering column. It was made by AC Delco, The part number from AC Delco for the tack was this 1548680. And when you got the tack on the steering column, the where the other tack or the normal tack was in the dash, it was covered with either an emblem or a flat plastic circle has been seen also. The clocks for 56 and 57 are a little different than the earlier clocks, and they were made by West Clock instead of Delco. They had a flat back on them instead of the rounded back. There's the stamping off to the right picture there. They also had a date code ink stamped on them. '58 to '62, dashes changed considerably. Gauges were right in front of the driver for everything. The speedometer increased from 140 to 160 mile per hour. The turn signals was at the lower right and lower left, and the high beam was now at the right side around 145 mile per hour dot, and the had emergency brake warning light was around the 15 mile per hour dot on the left side. The odometer was straight above, or the odometer. You still had black drums with white letters and white drum with black letter on the tenths. A little closer picture of the high beam, the brake warning light. The needle was also pale green on this. The numbers were put on the lens again, like they were in the earlier car. In '58, tachometers, you had for the hydraulic lifter camshaft cars, you had a different tack, and the solid lifter cars, they were driven by two different means. The hydraulic and the low horsepower mechanical was driven off of the generator with a gear part on the back of the generator, where the high horsepower fuel cars were driven off of the distributor. They still had the revolution counter in the lower horsepower cars. If it was driven off the generator, it registered cable speed, where if it was driven off of the distributor, it was registered twice the cable speed. And this was through all cars up to '62. When '62, they changed to drive all the tacks off of the distributor. So they all went to registering twice the cable speed in '62. There's where they were driven. You can see on the back of the tack here how the gear mechanism was hooked up to the back of the tack and went in, where on the fuel cars, it was driven right here off of the distributor. The gauges, '58, the needles were kind of straight up with a rounded end. They weren't tapered like they were in later cars. Large dots at the numbers, small dots in between the numbers again. The left side, the fuel and the temperature gauge on that side. A little closer picture of it, you can see the needle was kind of straight up with a rounded end. 60-pound oil pressure gauge. The clocks in 58. You can see the date stamp, ink stamped on the back, right in this area here. Difference between the Corvette and the passenger car clocks was the way to adjust the fast and slow. It was on the opposite sides. '59 tax. As I was looking in the judging manual, I believe they have a 60 tack in place of the 59 for the hydraulic cam, because it's got the later colored areas on the numbers, which you'll see here in a little bit. Basically the same. The hydraulic was different than the mechanical cams or the solid lifter cams cars. Gauges for 59. Lines were used instead of the dots. You had a long line at the numbers or the letters and a smaller line in between. The raised dome in the center was gone. It was straight across the bottom now. The needles are kind of still like the earlier ones, where they're kind of straight up with a rounded end. Later on, you'll see they taper. A little closer view of the fuel gauge. (1960) through mid 61s, and here you can see they've got color shading in the number area, and you'll notice that in the red line zone and the yellow caution zone, there is no markings for the numbers in these earlier cars. The coloring of them, kind of see the different shades there. Just the coloring the way it is. Was a different color green at the lower end than the higher end. You can kind of see the brake right in this area right here of the different color. They usually had a part number ink stamped on the back. Needles for the smaller gauges, 60, 61. You can see here they were tapered with a soft point on them. A little better view of it. How the earlier ones were kind of mostly straight up with a rounded end. These are tapered toward the end. Late 61, early 62, they changed from 220 degrees to 240 degrees on the temperature gauge. You can see this area here, they changed from the pale green to more of a tan color on both of the low horsepower and high horsepower tacks. Once again, you can see there's no lines in the area of the caution and the red line. Later in 62, you'll notice that there is lines in these, and I also, from what I found out, I read, the service replacements were like this. So if you see an earlier car with lines in there, it's probably a service replacement tack, from what I understand. little better view of it. You can kind of see the lines in the caution and the red zone. Like I said before, all 62s were driven off of the distributor, so they should read twice the cable speed. We'll take a break here. Is there any questions, or anybody got any more comments, or can you anybody want to add anything to what I've said, or tell me if I've done anything wrong?
Yeah, there's no chat questions right now, so anybody feel free to unmute yourselves. Oh, actually, one just came in. Let's see. Were the letters in the small gauges all red, or did they color match the dash?
The letters you're saying
And where it says TAC.
down
I'm
here,
guessing.
they were all red down here, if that's what he's asking. Yes.
I was asking the smaller gauges, like the battery and the fuel, that's lettering. If you go back a little farther.
Okay, let me. Yes,
Those
but you're
those
talking
were all
right.
red?
Yes. Yes.
They were all red no matter the dash color.
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody else? Any more comments? Nothing else, we'll start on the C2s then. Totally different dash. Layout with the gauges, everything still in front of the driver. You can see the difference here. They put the right turn signal and the left turn signal out to the side of the gauges. You had your high beam here. If your light buckets wasn't turned, they come on here, and the brake warning here. You can see them kind of lit up there. The speedometer, you can see that it went to 160 on the round. The speedometers had a cone, kind of a brushed aluminum cone in the middle. Black drums with white numbers again. On the trip odometer, you had black drums with white numbers on the main part of the mileage, and the tenths you had the white drum with the black letters again. The tachometer, like the speedometer, had a brushed aluminum cove in the middle. For the lower horsepower cars, you got a 5300 red line. The higher horsepower cars, the first 6,000 VINs, the coloring for the caution area was more of an orange color, and the early cars had what they called a buzzer tack, where you got to a certain RPM that a buzzer would go off. This was the buzzer, and they discontinued this shortly into production because with the car running and high RPMs, you could not hear the buzzer, so it was basically useless. The second style, they had 4 different styles of tachometers in 63 for the high horsepower. You can see here it's more of a yellow than an orange in the caution area right in here. It still had the buzzer terminal on the back, but there was no wires. Was used somewhere between approximate VIN number 7,000, 10,000 range. The third style had no buzzer terminal on the back, was used consistently after the 12,000 VIN number range. And the fourth style, no buzzer terminal on the back. The smaller gauges, the water temperature was 240. Early cars, the oil pressure gauge was at 60. Later cars, it went to 80. There you can see the two different oil pressure gauges. All gauges had the cone center with the brushed aluminum cone. Fuel in the battery. You can also see the cone in the middle with the brushed aluminum. The clocks for the C2s was made by Borg Industries. Early clocks had a longer hour hand than the later clocks. You can kind of see the difference here in this. The longer arms was somewhere to the around February range. Sometime in March or after that, they were all the shorter hand clocks. '64 gauges, instead of having the coned brush aluminum, they had a coned black with kind of circular marks around there on the way in. The tachometers, basically the numbering and that stuff was the same as the 63s, just the cone was different. This is for the lower horsepower cars. The higher horsepower cars, larger red line. Amp gauge, you can see it had the cone in the middle with the black circles. Fuel gauge. Water temps at 240. And all 64s used an 80-pound oil gauge. Clocks had a date on the back. You can see here that had Borg right here with a registered trademark. The date code was ink stamped again, black. Back of the 63, 64 clusters. You'll see later on there was two lights added in this area right here for the 65s and on. There you can see the extra holes for the dash lighting. '65 cluster, we lost the cone in the middle and went to a flat surface for the gauges. All gauges were flat. Speedometer. You can see the drums for the odometer were still black with white lettering. There's a export car with a kilometer speedometer instead of the mile per hours. The low horsepower tachometer for the 65s. There's the higher horsepower 350. Was at 6 grand instead of the lower ones. And then the higher horsepower cars. So you had three different tachs for starting in 65 for the different horsepower ranges. Water temp and oil pressure. You can see here that later on you'll see a warning mark in this area on the water temperature gauges where it wasn't put on there in 65. The oil pressure gauges for the lower horsepower had a single mark up here, where the higher horsepower, the 80-pound gauges, had two marks up in this area. Fuel and battery on the other side. The clock went to a 24-hour marking. Here you'll see the difference between the 65 water temperature gauge versus the 66, 67. Speedometer is the same for the as the 65. In 67, they had a speed warning. When you got the speed warning, you'll notice that there is no part sticking out from the other side of the needle. And the tack does not have a tail sticking off the other side of it like the earlier ones do. You go back here, you can see the tail sticking off the other side, or the telltale ones do not. And that's it for the C2s. Do we have any questions or comments, or anybody got anything else to add? Or
Yeah, a couple of chat questions. What was the first year for the trip odometer in the C2s?
I believe 63 they had them.
Okay, and then for 63, the buzzers that were on the tacks, is that something that is judged for being present or not?
You can see that if you look underneath the dash. I don't know how many people are aware of this and go actually look for it. It would have to, I mean, if you look at the VIN number of the car, you can kind of tell whether it should have one. And I suppose you could look under there and see. If you had a mirror, you could kind of go up and see if that was on there. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody that judges 63s can chime in and say how into detail you go into that. Maybe we don't have anybody that judges 63s.
It's pretty difficult to see
Yes.
on a 63 because the back pan being deeper than the 65 and later's, it's up against the dash cross brace.
Okay.
You'd have to have some mirrors and lights and stick your hand in there pretty carefully and be about 100 pounds.
Okay.
And another question, a few slides ago, you showed the oil pressure gauges that had those white marks on the top. One had one, the other had two. What was the purpose of those markings?
I can't really tell you that. It's just that the 60-pound gauges only had one marking, and the 80 pounds had two markings. Maybe it was to help the guys on the line make sure they got the right. Well, yeah, this should come as an assembly. So maybe it's the guys assembling the gauges. I'm not sure.
And then the question on the 67, that, or actually no, it wasn't for the speedo binder, but it was, the question is on the tack buzzer. Is that something to be judged during PV?
If it's got the tack warning, or I'm sure on the 63s, what they're saying on the 63, if the warning buzzer.
It's for the tack, yeah, if it had the buzzer on the 63, does that get performance verified? And I would assume the same thing with the speedo, speed minder on the 67, would that be part of the PV, that it works?
I'm sure it should be. Like I said, on the 63s, they discontinued because you couldn't hardly hear it. So you'd really have to be listening, but I'm sure if somebody, I don't know if there's anybody on that actually does the PVs on them right now, but if they are, if you know anything about it, speak up. But I'm sure they should be.
Yeah, it would make sense. No different than you check an option of your power windows working or your tilt and your telescoping.
Yes.
Not every car had it, but if the car is equipped with the option, it should be functioning.
And then there's another question for the C2s or the speedometer. Let's see here. The speedometer and tachometer lenses flat, concave, or convex. One thing I can add to that related to those is because my 67 has the speed warning. So the tach lens is glass where the speed warning lens is plastic, because I believe they didn't want to have to drill a little hole for that adjustment through glass, and they put a plastic lens in for that one.
Okay.
So then, Mike, are the lenses flat, concave, or convex for the C2s?
Concave, like your
Okay.
clock.
I knew I'd read that somewhere and I had it in my notes, but I'd have to look.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question in regards to the odometer scrolls?
Do what now?
The odometer scrolls, the numbers where you have
Yeah.
black on your primary and white on your 10th counter,
Yes.
are all mid-years silk screen applied on top of the plastic drum? So I've seen, I think certainly the later service ones or reproduction are plastic where they're hot stamped in.
I'm not sure how them are put on the drums, to be truthful with you. I'll have to do some more investigation on that.
And just one thing we crossed over, we sort of touched on the plastic lens. 63 uses a plastic lens set for all your instruments,
Yes, correct.
all your gauges, which didn't go on, but
Yeah, thank you. I know there's a lot of stuff that I've got in here that I kind of forget to bring up. So yeah, if you hear something like that or I miss something, please speak up.
yeah,
Mike,
excellent.
Mike on the
Excellent detail.
odometer,
I'm sorry?
Mike on the odometers, all the
Yes.
instruments were painted.
They were painted on.
Drums painted and the numbers were painted on. Later replacements are all plastic.
Right. Okay. That confirms my suspicion. Thank you.
And another question on 63s, when did the steering column cap start?
When did the steering column?
Cap. I'm not quite sure what that refers to.
I'm not sure what they're asking.
So Jack, if you want to, let's see,
I
between
believe at the very end of the 63 run, they ran out of the correct gauge clusters.
Correct.
And they were using 64 clusters, and they put a filler piece between the top of the steering column and the base of the cluster.
Yes. It's very toward the end of 63, but I really don't have I think we may have covered that maybe a little bit on the earlier, when I was doing the dashes. I think I brought that up, but I don't remember exactly when it was for sure. But yeah, there was two different notches or cutouts for the steering column.
And then the 24-hour clock, did that continue into 66 and 67?
Yes.
Okay, any other chat questions or anybody else want to unmute?
Anybody got anything they'd like to add? I want to learn too, people. Okay.
Hang on. I got one thing to add. The nut bezel that surrounds your key switch, the key cylinder.
Yes.
There's a couple of different designs.
Yes, we went over that in the
Okay.
dash part.
Right. Okay. No problem.
Yeah, there's a where they got 3 notches and 4 notches changed from 65, 66, I think. And the indent was chromed in 65 and it was kind of brushed in 66.
Thank
Is
you.
that what you were talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else?
Hey, quick question. I lost my connection right before at the end of the C1 section. The TAD section that goes up to 4,000 RPM in the 62s, is there any significance to that?
The what now?
On the tachometer in a 62, up to 4,000 RPM, it's tan, and then at 4,000 it turns green. I
Oh,
suspect it has to do with cam tuning, or tuning of the system. But
I don't know if there's any specific reason why it's like that. I never found a reason why, but I know they changed some coloring through the late C1s, but I can't tell you why or.
okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, we'll move on to the C3s. Dash changes again with the body style change. The tach and the speedometer was in front of the driver. You can see that in this, the right turn is in the tachometer, the left turn is in the speedometer. You got your trip odometer below, the odometer at top, your bright light, and your brake warning. Speedometer was 160 mile per hour. The numbers were light green tint. 68 and 69, you could get the speed warning in these 2 years also, like you could in the 67s. Except the tail on these was still there, like it was, unlike it was gone in the 67s. Tachometers, you can see the low horsepower, the mid-low horsepower, the mid-high horsepower, and the high horsepower. We had 4 different tach ranges in the 68s, on up through, I don't remember how far we go through here. We'll get to it. 68, your smaller gauges was in the center. The gauge housing itself. Whoa, what happened here? The gauge housing itself was a smooth black metal on the had green tint on the numbers. There was a couple different combinations of the warning lights. You could get a door jar by itself with a blank. You could get a door jar with a low fuel, or you could get a low fuel with a blank. On the opposite side, you had a seat belt with a switch to shut it off. You can see the switch knob is missing in this particular picture on the left side. There's the lenses for the little warning lights along the side. The later 68s, you ended up, instead of, you could get, or you got a wiper override instead of the low fuel or door jar. Well, the door jar is still there, but you can see that the housing around it is still smooth for 68, where you'll see it is textured in 69. There's a 69, you can see the texture, and you get a wiper override, and possibly an early 69, but then you got a headlamp in 69 with a textured metal housing. You can see the push button to cancel the seatbelt light here on this one. There's the door ajar and headlamp lens for the right side. Excuse me. 1970, the bright light was red. Indicator was red in early 70, and later on it changed to blue. In 72, you can see we still got the textured housing around there, but we lost the switch to shut off the seatbelt warning light in early 72s, there was a timer about 15 seconds, shut it off. In later cars, you had to actually pull out the seatbelt to get it to shut off.
Hey, Mike, on the wiper override switch, what is the purpose of that? Or the light?
Gary Bosselman, you on here?
Yes, the wiper override would show that the door was not open when you turn the wipers on.
Okay. Something like the light switch on the C2s, where if the door wasn't open, it would light up, correct?
Correct.
Here's the lens for the 72 and later when you got the fasten seat belt on the right or on the left side without the switch. Instead of just fasten belts, it's got fasten seat belts. Color change in 72 from the green tint to the white, which is very hard to see, correct, Gary?
Very difficult. A light, if you shine light on them, it becomes very evident, but otherwise, just a quick glance will be hard to see.
'73 to '74 gauges, there's a little change. You can see here the warning area on the temperature gauge is a little wider on the 74s, and also the oil pressure gauge went to 80 pounds rather than 70 pounds. Still have the textured metal housing around it. In 75, the speedometer picked up kilometers around the inside. '74 to '75, you also had a change in the font of the lettering here. You can see the difference in the O in the oil pressure is more squatted in this one, where it's more elongated in this. Same way with your battery, they're more squatted and more elongated over here. Also, you'll see here in 75, we got unleaded fuel only versus fuel in 74. Little better view of the 75. '76 versus '77 gauges. You can see here there's a metal housing in the 70, actually 68 through 76, and 77 it went to a plastic housing. You can also see that the numbering is on the outside of the circles in the earlier cars, versus there is actually no circles here. There's just the numbers with the lettering and numbers on the inside. Also, the water temperature and the fuel gauge was reversed. Before, the fuel gauge was over to the left, the water temperature was to the right. You got different warning lights, and we went back to just fasten the belts at the top half. You got the low fuel and the generator on the right side. Also in 77, you went from a amp meter to a voltmeter. '78 dash was the tachometer and the speedometer area was changed. It wasn't recessed back in the circles like it was. It's more flat and out to you farther. Went to 140 mile-an-hour speedometer. The kilometers went to being blue on the inside range in here. And you'll also notice that the drums, instead of the tenths being white with black numbers. They are now yellow with black numbers. There is a export car with the kilometers on the outside and the mile per hour on the inside. The L82s was designated with an L82 down here at the bottom of the tack versus the L48s was blank. In the center, you had warning lights, the turn signal's top, brake at the bottom, the high beams is in the middle. You can also see the generator light on the right side. And they changed from letters to symbols for the gauges, what they did. '79 early cars had 140 mile-an-hour speedometers versus the later 79s. They ran out of speedometers because of the length of run for 79s, and they had to go to the 80, which went to an 85 mile per hour. And you'll also check to see here the Corvette emblem is different from the 79 to the 80. You'll also check the odometer, or the trip odometer drum here went from black lettering and white letters to the orange letters, or the orange drums with black letters, and the tenths was white with black letters. There's the speedometer, tachometer early versus late in '79. You can also see the difference in the emblems there. Also, there was down in this corner of the tachometer was supposedly a choke light, which was not used in '79. The the tachometer for the 140 mile-an-hour speedometers versus the tachometer for the 85 mile-an-hour speedometers. '80, it's the same as the late '79s. Showed you the differences there. 1980, from a lot of research here, there may have been some 80s with the quartz clock used. Rick Koch, are you on?
Yep.
You want to comment on that? Part of what we kind of figured out, I guess.
Right now, I don't remember, Mike.
It was something to do with, I think in '80 they started using a computer in the California cars, and possibly some of the quartz clocks may have been associated with somehow with the computer cars for California. But there has been some '80s with the quartz clock. For the most part, they just use the standard clock. I believe that's the way we've come up with on that.
I believe that's what we found out.
Yeah. 1981, the speedometer and the tachometer. In 1981 and '82, if you got the ETR radios, you got an oil temperature gauge instead of a clock, because the clock was in the ETR radio. And that's electronic tuned radio. And when you got the computer cars starting in '81, the computers was in all the cars. you got a check engine light, and the low fuel light and the check engine light was in a yellowish amber color rather than the red. And you've got a, instead of having a battery on there, or the letters themselves, it had a symbol of the battery on there. And the fasten the seat belts, you can see the little guy with the seat belt across him was added. Here's a standard radio, and you can see it's got the quartz clock above it. '82 dash. '81 versus the '82. You can see the difference in the lettering here. The 10s was added. Went 5-mile-an-hour increments versus the 10. And the tack in '82, you can see it has crossfire injection on the tack itself. And that's for the C2s. We got questions or comments, or anybody want to add anything?
Yeah, a few chat questions. When you talked about the wiper override warning on the early C3s, how would that warning light get cleared? Will it automatically turn off once the door opens, or is there a different procedure?
Yes, from what I understand, the switches down in there, when they open up, will shut it off. Correct, Gary?
That's correct, but if you turn it on and the light comes on, that means that it could mean that the round knob at the bottom of the column would need to be turned to turn the power on to the motor, or it could be that the door isn't open. Then you would pull the wiper switch knob down, the vacuum knob at the bottom of the steering column.
Then 75, you mentioned the fuel gauge. It started to say unleaded fuel. Did Corvettes have any kind of similar decal near the fuel cap?
Yes, there was a unleaded fuel around the edge of the bezel on the around the fuel cap itself. I think it was it on the fuel cap in 75? I know it's around the bezel later on in the C3s, but I'm not sure in 75 exactly where it was. But there was, yeah, there was a warning around the fuel cap area.
Then on slide 124, you mentioned the choke light. What does that actually indicate?
Nothing on the earlier cars. I don't know if it was used in the 81s and 2s. Rick, are you on there? Can you help me out on that?
I'm not real sure what it meant. It would probably be more after they put that computer in there. Maybe it's an indication it's not working, or it's, nobody's ever asked that question. That's something I'll find out. I'll dig into that.
Yeah, and somebody mentioned his 81 has a choke light.
Yeah, they started in 80 or 81. I'm not 81.
Just put on as it comes on if it's apparently the engine's very cold, and he should know up there in Wisconsin.
Okay, thank you.
And then somebody just asked about that red curved line on the current screen. I think that's just a Photoshop line.
Yeah, I just put that under there to kind of highlight the Corvette, the emblem itself on that, because it changes through the year, or from 80, 80, 79, 80, 81. They're all a little different.
That's it for the chat questions.
Any comments? Okay, move on to the C4s. Of course, the speedometer and tachometer was all digital. Everything was digital in the C4s, the early C4s. You can see the turn signals and the bright light indicator was below the center where the secondary gauges were, and them you could change of what you wanted to read out by changing the switches here in the knob. What the? You could change what you wanted to read out in the center part of the dash by changing the by switching these switches. You could go from coolant temperature to volts or oil pressure to oil temperature. Your trip odometer, you can change your range or the trip odometer, and the instantaneous fuel rate or the average rate. You reset them with the push buttons down here on the bottom too. You could go from English to metric. Your driver information center, 84 and 85, this is what was on them. If you had a 4-speed car and you had the overdrive, you had this function down here. The 85 changed a little bit. In this area right here was the main area. You can see the difference. The coloring was a little different also. The 84s, there was 3 lines for the unleaded fuel, where an 85 and on, it's just 2 lines. '86, you got an upshift arrow added to the tachometer area. '86, '87, the driver information center. Instead of the overdrive, you had an emblem down here then. '87, you can see we got an overdrive emblem right here now. '88, pretty much the same as the '87. There's the driver information. If you got a Callaway car, you got a boost gauge for the turbos in place of one of the vents. In '89, you lost the overdrive emblem because of the 6-speed transmission. '89 driver information panel. You got the low tire pressure sensors if you needed to service it, if it was having some issues. Was added in the '89 driver info center. '90 and '91, you lost a lot of the digital readouts. Your speedometer was still digital. It was at the lower part of the center section. You can see here the turn signal was above here with the bright lights. The right turn signal would have been over here. You can see all of the warning lights around the outside. The L89 engine in 1991 had a lower red line, had a 6,000 RPM tach. versus the ZR1s, which had an 8,000 RPM tach. Letters were all orange. The driver information center for a 90. '91. 91 driver information center. You could change whatever you wanted to read out in the lower part of the readout above the, or on your gauge readout up to the top. '92. You can see the speedometer went from the lower area to the above the fuel gauge here. You can also see the warning lights around the outside. Driver information center. Readouts for 92, 93. 94 to 96. Lettering was in white. See the speedometer is still above the fuel gauge. And the odometer is in digital down below. Your knobs change from the gray color to black color for the readouts. 94 to 96 driver information readout area. LT1 had a lower red line than the ZR1s in 95. See the higher red line area. 96. That's it for the C4s. Is there any comments or any questions or?
Yeah, let's see, a couple chats. You mentioned a choke warning light on an 87, but it was an L98 with fuel injection. Any reason why it would still have a choke warning light?
Oh. No, I'll have to do some digging on that one to see.
And then there was just a comment, all computer faults can be displayed in the code format on a 93.
Okay.
That's it for chat questions.
Any comments? Anything to add?
Was the LT4 in 96 a different red line on the tach?
Yes, that over the standard. There was two, yeah, there was two red lines for the two different motors, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. C5 instrument panel. Oh, a lot different. This picture here is out of the owner's manual, and you can kind of see some of the warning lights that can come on in this area here. These were all warning lights that will come on. You can kind of see them here. Some of the warning lights in the background. The odometer's digital down below. It's also got a readout in there of information you can change. There you can see a bunch of the warning lights on in the dash area. '99, you got added a for the heads-up display. You had some switches over here, was added in, and I believe this was moved from up in this area down to this area. There's the heads-up display on top of the dash that displays it up onto the windshield. There's your controls for that. And there's actually a display on the windshield. You can change what you want up there. Here are some of the different things that you can bring up. This is out of the owner's manual. It kind of explains it all out. Uh, 2001. The C5s are pretty much all the same, just some of the warning lights changed, and for the most part, the gauges were all basically the same. Red line might have changed on the Z06s. You can kind of see, I tried to point out some of the warning lights in the background. (2003), you got the 50th anniversary emblems in the background. You got the Z06, you've got kind of a checkerboard background rather than the plain flat, and it also has Z06 in the tachometer. Here you can see a door ajar warning down here in the information center where the odometer normally is. (2004) Z06. Still see the checkerboard background. There's some of the warning lights lit up. A later car. (2004). Like I say, these pictures here were all out of the owner's manuals. Close-up picture of the speedometer in a Z06. You can see this car has been drove a lot, 13 miles. (2005). Do we want to quit at the C5 or the C5s? Does anybody have any comments or anything they want to add?
Yeah, there was a question on the LCD displays in the early C4s, if those were problematic with functioning properly, and then do you know if Chevy got negative feedback on those and that's why they switched back to the traditional speedo and tach later on?
Well, I'll put it like this. I got an 85 with 300,000 miles on it, and I have not had any problems with the gauges. I don't know whether I've been lucky or, but yeah, I guess there was a lot of negative feedback. They were considered too gimmicky from what I've heard a lot of. So that's why they went back to the analog gauges more or less. Truth with you, I really like my 85. I mean, it tells me right what's going on, and like I said, with 300,000 mile on it, it still works fine.
That's it for chat questions.
Any comments? I just got a couple slides on the C6s here, so. There's a C6 gauge cluster off of the owner's manual. The needles have changed a little bit. And I guess that was it. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. I hope you got a little bit out of it, and hope to see you at the next one on the radios.
Yep. Just a reminder, March 4th for part 4, pre-register, and then about a week or so, we'll send out an email with a link to download today's presentation. It'll also go on the Heart of Ohio website, and give us about 2 weeks before you start checking to make sure your points were awarded. So with that, like Mike said, we appreciate everybody joining. I think you did another great presentation, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you,
Great
Nick.
job.
Thank you, Mike. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.